Okay, now Basic Education Minister Angie Motshekka is expected to give an update on preparations for the reopening of schools later this evening at 6 p.m. Schools have now been closed for over 2 months in efforts to curb the spread of COVID-19. Education expert from the University of Johannesburg, Nicky joins me now from for a little bit of insight ahead of that briefing at 6 p.m. tonight. Now, Nicky, thank you so much for joining us. What we know at the present moment is that some schools are ready, some schools are not. Same thing when it comes to provinces as well. When the minister speaks tonight, what do you think a biggest challenge is going to be?
Well, I think her biggest challenge is going to be that whatever she says, not everyone will be happy. And that's because I think there's not one size fits all to this response. So in managing a national system, there's a whole lot of different things to consider, and our schools are very different from each other. So what might work for an urban school would fall completely flat in a rural area, where on the one hand you might be able to use a more blended learning, where you've got some work from home strategy, you've got some work at school strategy in an urban area using data and hopefully getting a zero-rated education service for that purpose. In rural areas, on the other hand, they're completely different ways of working that are needed. And I think the key challenge facing schools, which is something that they have, I know the Department of Basic Education colleagues have been working hard at, is making sure that schools are ready first from a health perspective. So making sure that the personal protective gear for workers and teachers is available, that there's sufficient sanitizer, that there are thermometers, in working with a health risk that is necessitated by having people in groups. Irrespective of the age. So I do feel for the minister tonight. I think whatever she says, there will be pundits in the media who will slate whatever it is, depending on their political agenda, but also from their particular perspective, knowing that schools are actually very varied. And whatever is proposed won't suit everyone.
Nicky, there's also a liability issue here, isn't there? Because I'm a father. You tell me I can send my kid to school now. Something happens to my kid when he gets to that school. Who's liable for that?
Absolutely. So I think there's liability and there's significant fear from parents who wouldn't like their children to be going into spaces where they might contract a virus. Not only for their children's safety, but for the grandparents and the older people in the homestead that they come back to. And so what I'm really hoping for from the minister this evening is not just the big question that everybody's asking, which is when will schools open, but what will we do in the meantime? So we know that there's going to be a phased approach. We know that there's going to be significant disruption to school for a long time, from parents either voluntarily saying they don't want to send their children to school and keeping them at home, then they need to be taking on some responsibility for their learning. How do we get learn from home programs that work well, using print where that's the only option and using data where that's a viable solution? So I'm hoping that we have some kind of reassurance about the readiness of schools, which I expect will be differentiated and not everybody at the same time, or provinces or all schools at the same time. And then the second thing I'm really hoping for is that we have a communication strategy with parents. So you might have had with your son, I'm not sure whether your school has been in touch with you, but not all schools have databases of parents, ways to communicate efficiently, cheaply, to allow for there to be learning that might happen from home, particularly for the older learners who might be more able to self-regulate for that.
Now, Nicky, that's on the children's side. On the teacher side as well, you've got the National Professional Teachers Organization of South Africa. They don't really like this phased approach as well. They're saying it'll leave many pupils behind. The minister's also got to get the buy-in of all the teachers, doesn't she?
Absolutely, and I think that is something that we can applaud our government for. They have taken a consultative process in all their decision making. There was a strong pushback on the original plan, so this is a second stab at trying to put something forward, which I understand the unions have been fully engaged with, appropriately so. It's the teachers and workers who are at risk primarily. But at the same time, there's both a health, nutrition, and education imperative to make sure that those who are able to learn are able to continue in some way. I disagree with NAPTOSA that a phased approach is not appropriate. I think our government has been cautious in trying to say, let's prioritize grade 7, let's prioritize grade 12, get systems working, and then also be able to learn from what happens. We've seen in France that they opened up, I think, a week ago and already are having a big backlash from 70 cases, new cases as a result of schools opening. And so I think our ability to try something, see how it goes, and then react to what we're seeing is going to be key to how our schooling is approached.
And now when it comes to the subject of nutrition that you touched on there, Nicky, we've got families, speaking about the rural areas and other areas which are pretty impoverished. We've got families and kids that are coming out of this COVID-19 lockdown, and, many people are going hungry, so they're going to be going to school now. How important now are those feeding schemes to these type of schools?
No, so 60% of our schools do need the feeding schemes. It's a major part of how health and education join up. So it is a very important component of what schools offer. Schools offer also a reliable source of information to communicate with community. The school there are more schools than there are clinics. And so using those facilities as a way to get the health message out is really important. For the matriculants, there has been a lot of thinking about what that might look like. It's why matric has been prioritized at a high school level. There are options in terms of reducing the holidays, extending the year to beyond December or into January. And there also have been proposals for what's been called curriculum trimming. So we've been looking at which topics might be withdrawn from particular grades and syllabi to make sure that assessment is fair, given that this has been a disrupted year. I think of those all quite short-term solutions, though, and my sense is that we need to be able to answer the ongoing question of how do we deal with disruption in schooling. So having some learn from home options and robust ways to communicate with parents, particularly in the no-fee school area, in terms of making sure that there's zero-rated educational communication between schools and parents, to me is a priority. This is not going to be a short-term thing where we can have an answer of, okay, it's June, no, it's July, that's going to go back. The key thing is how we're going to manage under these new circumstances.
Listen, it's incredibly complicated, and I really feel for the education department. Just lastly, Nicky, are we being realistic here? Because when it comes to social distancing with kids, these guys and girls have been missing each other. They're going to be so happy to get that interaction going with some of their friends. It's unrealistic that we expect them to practice social distancing, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's completely unrealistic. I think our only chance is to try and think about schools being in different zones, so limiting how many children interact with each other. But having been in the classroom for a long time and as a mother of teenagers, there's absolutely no way you can social distance in a school. I think all we can hope is making sure that people are being safe in terms of at least wearing a mask when they are touching each other, that there's a lot of sanitizing available at school. And that we limit the number of children that are interacting with each other so that we know how to respond to a case when someone is found to be positive.
Thank you so much, Nicky Roberts, for speaking with us. Nicky Roberts there from the University of Johannesburg, as we await that briefing from the Minister of Basic Education, Angie Motshekga.